A passenger on a flight tried to humiliate a black CEO's child, but the father's response left the entire cabin in stunned silence. A passenger dangled a baby by one arm as a joke. Thinking the father would panic in silence, he didn't realize the man he mocked could end the entire cabin's laughter with one strike. The moment the baby cried, the father moved, and the passenger went flying toward the ceiling panel. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses instantly when true strength rises. The jolt came just as Dr. Jaron Malvec stepped onto the aircraft. A quick tremor, the kind passengers often dismissed as routine pre-flight turbulence, but Jaron didn't dismiss it. His instincts, honed by years of defense-grade systems engineering and too many sleepless nights as a single father, reacted instantly. He tightened his hold around his infant son, Corin, who stirred slightly in his chest carrier but did not cry. The slight shudder of the fuselage passed, yet something lingered in the air, a stillness not of peace, but caution unacknowledged. Row 14, just down that way, sir. The flight attendant gestured politely. Jaron nodded, thanking him, and moved down the aisle with the ease of someone used to operating under pressure, though fatigue clung to the corners of his eyes. As he approached his assigned seat, a tall man already sat by the window, fiddling with something in his lap. He looked up abruptly and forced a crooked smile. "Cute kid," the man said. "Thanks." Jaron replied evenly, sliding into the aisle seat. He adjusted Corin's blanket and settled his carry-on beneath the seat, his peripheral vision still processing the man's posture. The stranger introduced himself with an awkward chuckle. "Redden Corval. Been flying all day." "You?" "Jaron," he replied curtly, intentionally omitting his last name. He rarely mentioned his title when traveling. It invited conversation, questions, or worse, assumptions. But Redden didn't need a name. His eyes had already found the baby carrier. "So small," he murmured, tilting his head and leaning forward slightly, as if to peek more closely at the sleeping infant. "Barely the size of a loaf of bread." Jaron's brow flicked down almost imperceptibly. He shifted his shoulder just enough to block the view. "He's 6 months," he said, his voice calm but layered with subtle firmness. "Just asleep?" A laugh from Redden followed, dry and too loud for setting. "I was just saying, people don't make babies like they used to. Everything's smaller now. We coddle too much, don't we?" He rubbed his wrist absent-mindedly, glancing over his shoulder toward the aisle. Jaron didn't respond. He didn't need to. His attention dropped to that hand. Specifically, how Redden's fingers kept tapping his wrist with a nervous rhythm. Not agitated, exactly, but calculated, like someone waiting for a cue. The plane filled quickly around them. A teenage boy a few rows up filmed himself for what sounded like a vlog, narrating the trip. Others jostled bags into overhead bins. A crew member apologized for the delay with the beverage cart, and someone coughed twice behind Jaron's seat. Background noise. Ordinary travel chaos. And yet, nothing felt ordinary. Jaron retrieved a bottle from the side pouch of his backpack, checked the seal, then returned it. He was preparing for every stage of the flight, like he did every night since becoming Corin's sole guardian, organized, alert, and always ready to pivot. The speech for tomorrow's ethics symposium was saved on his tablet, a proposal that could redefine safety protocols for infants in public infrastructure. But the irony did not escape him. He'd built systems to protect thousands, and now all he had to protect was one. Redden leaned in again, this time under the pretense of checking the in-flight magazine. "You heading to Norvane for work?" Jaron kept his tone neutral. "Presentation." "Oh, yeah? I do consulting. System stuff." Redden's hand moved as he spoke, gesturing vaguely. "I've worked with some pretty high-level firms. Havex, Relmer, that crowd." The names made Jaron glance up. Havex, that was a direct competitor. They'd lost a bid to Errant Systems, his company, only 2 quarters ago. Still, he didn't react visibly. "Small world," Jaron said instead, though something tightened in his chest. As the cabin crew closed the overhead bins, Redden grew more animated. He cracked his knuckles one by one, then stretched his neck from side to side like a boxer warming up. His eyes drifted repeatedly toward the aisle, then toward the cockpit, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. Jaren tracked all of it in his peripheral vision. Angles, pacing, fidgeting. Something wasn't right. The door sealed with a quiet hydraulic hum. The jet engines began their low roar, and the plane eased back from the gate. "I've always liked turbulence," Redden said suddenly, loud enough for Jaren to hear over the hum. "Shakes things loose. Makes people show who they really are." Jaren stared out the window now, not in fear, but in assessment. A man who praised turbulence was either reckless or deeply disturbed. Either way, it wasn't good news for someone seated beside a 6-month-old baby. Redden's wrist tapping resumed. Faster this time, like a metronome counting down to something unspoken. The plane accelerated down the runway. Corin stirred in the carrier, his mouth working silently in sleep. Jaren rested a hand over his son's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his tiny breaths. He did not close his eyes. He never slept during takeoff, not since becoming a father. There was too much at stake. As the aircraft lifted off the tarmac and climbed into the sky, Jaren took one final breath of cabin air before sealing away his unease. Beside him, Redden's grin widened as the nose of the plane angled upward, light turbulence already starting to rattle the tray tables. His head tilted once more toward the infant. The smile that formed was too wide, too knowing. Something in the air felt wrong before anyone understood why. The seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime just as the aircraft reached cruising altitude, and the cabin lights brightened slightly in tandem with the steward's hushed announcement. It gave an illusion of normalcy, of calm skies and routine comfort, but the truth sat inches away from Jaren Malvek, cloaked in polite unease and unspoken alarm. Redden Corval leaned forward again. "You know," he said, voice edged with forced casualness, "people don't toughen kids up anymore. Wrap 'em in blankets, whisper lullabies. It's no wonder they grow soft." Jaren didn't turn to look at him. His hand stayed focused, carefully adjusting the bottle warmer clipped to the seat pocket. He gave a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "He's 6 months old. He doesn't need toughness. He needs peace." Redden chuckled, short, dry, more like a tick than laughter. "Peace, huh?" His eyes flicked down toward the baby carrier nestled securely in Jaren's lap. "Bet he cries the second anything shakes." Jaren's body tensed, but his tone remained diplomatic. "He's calm now. Let's keep it that way." Across the aisle, Laird Dane sat in quiet tension, his head tilted just slightly toward the exchange. His arms were crossed, and though he looked out the window, his eyes occasionally darted toward Redden with increasing suspicion. Laird had noticed a man earlier, pacing too long in the jet bridge, tapping his shoe in odd rhythms, glancing at other passengers as if counting something. But he'd said nothing. Now, he told himself, the father seemed in control. Still, something gnawed at his conscience. Suddenly, a low shudder passed through the cabin. The plane dipped momentarily before leveling out, prompting the drink cart 2 rows up to pause and lock. One of the flight attendants braced herself with a hand on a headrest and radioed quietly for a turbulence update. The atmosphere grew subtly alert. Crew members, now distracted, turned their focus to galley items and passenger safety checks, rather than seat interactions. Redden seized the moment. "Want me to help?" he asked, leaning sideways. His hand extended, hovering just above the edge of the carrier as if debating whether to touch it. "I've got 2 nieces, twins. Grew up rough but strong." Jaren's hand moved calmly but firmly, placing his arm between the carrier and Redden's reach. "Please don't," he said, his voice even but steely. "You don't need to help." Redden's face twitched in a forced grin, the kind that barely masked irritation. Man, people take things so seriously these days. He slumped back with a huff but kept his eyes on Corin, whose fingers curled loosely in sleep. The baby let out a quiet sigh, oblivious to the growing storm around him. Jaren adjusted his seat belt with one hand and lifted Corin slightly, resting him higher on his chest. He angled his body more defensively without making it obvious. His thoughts weren't loud, but they were sharp. He didn't like the proximity, didn't like the fixation, and he definitely didn't like the tap-tap-tapping Redden had begun again, his fingers now exploring the overhead panel, trying to figure out how the air nozzles work. Jaren asked coolly, watching the man out of the corner of his eye. "Nah," Redden replied. "Just checking how firm this panel is." You know, planes are built tough, but everything has a weak spot. That sentence sat like a stone between them. Jaren said nothing. Redden's fingers lingered on the overhead surface a moment longer before pulling back. He clasped his hands together in his lap and began humming. Tuneless, slow, the kind of sound meant to make others uncomfortable. Lyric Dane leaned slightly forward now, the unease on his face plain. He finally turned toward the aisle as if preparing to flag down a flight attendant, but then sat back again, hesitating. No one else seemed alarmed. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it was nothing. The cabin lights flickered once, triggered by the plane's automated response to outside weather patterns. A mild drop in pressure rippled along the floor. Jaren felt Corin shift slightly in his arms. He rocked him gently, one hand moving in slow, measured circles over the infant's back, the other still resting defensively near the seat divider. From the corner of his eye, he caught Redden watching again. I said he's fine, Jaren repeated, this time without a smile. Redden leaned back, his mouth stretching into a smile that held no warmth. Sure thing, boss. Just admiring how peaceful he is. Almost like nothing could ever go wrong. A pause. And yet, he added softly, glancing once more toward the ceiling. Jaren's breath caught briefly, but not from fear. From clarity. This wasn't random nervousness. This man was rehearsing something. Mentally, Jaren cataloged every detail. The twitch of Redden's fingers, the rhythm of his words, the precise moment he'd tested the panel above. A pattern emerged. Not a loud one, but a pattern all the same. The turbulence returned, gently at first, then sharper. The drink cart up front halted again. Passengers buckled in tighter. A few crew members reemerged, checking compartments, unaware that their attention would soon be needed elsewhere. Jaren repositioned the baby's blanket. His fingers moved calmly, but his mind now operated like the strategist he once was years before fatherhood. Defense systems, predictive AI, behavioral mapping. He had once studied volatility, like this in human test cases. But he never thought he'd apply that knowledge here, in a cabin, in the sky, with his son asleep in his arms. Still, he didn't move. Not yet. He watched. He waited. Because something about Redden's energy wasn't just unstable, it was preparatory. The moment before chaos, Jaren thought grimly, always feels too normal to recognize. Jaren shifted back just as Redden leaned in. Relax, man. I'm just joking around, Redden said with a grin that didn't match the sharp gleam in his eyes. Then, without warning, his arm shot forward. Jaren saw the motion a second too late. In that fraction of time, his thoughts didn't even have a chance to form words. Just a primal surge of dread. Redden's hand reached straight into baby carrier, bypassing every unspoken boundary of space and safety, and closed around Corin's tiny arm. The infant cried out, a high, startled wail that sliced through the cabin's low murmur. Gasps erupted. A woman across the aisle clapped her hand over her mouth. A man 2 rows behind dropped his coffee. Jaren's heart plunged. He froze for half a second, then surged forward, but Redden had already leaned back, holding Corin aloft by one arm, the baby's legs swinging helplessly in the air. The expression on Redden's face wasn't one of horror or even mischief. It was amusement. He laughed, openly and without restraint, as though dangling a 6-month-old child by one arm was a harmless party trick. I said I was joking, he chuckled, eyes darting between Jaren and the other passengers, daring someone to make it serious. Jaren's entire world narrowed to the baby dangling just out of reach. His mind, usually trained to assess robotic algorithms, now calculated human damage. One wrong move, one startled twitch from Redden, and Corin's shoulder could dislocate. One sharp bump of turbulence, and the child could fall. Get him back, Jaren said, low and steady, holding both palms up. His voice wasn't angry yet. It was controlled, desperate. Now. But Redden tilted his head like a child playing keep away. You're too uptight, man. Seriously, he's fine. Behind Jaren, someone finally unbuckled, and Lyric Dane, the same passenger who had silently noticed Redden's odd behavior earlier, stood up halfway, frozen in place. I saw him, Lyric muttered, but the words died in his throat. The flight attendants were nowhere to be seen, trapped behind a service cart near the front of the cabin. Jaren's peripheral vision caught the flicker of seatbelt signs still lit, and the occasional jostle of light turbulence rolling through the fuselage. The lights overhead dimmed slightly, momentarily flickering, as if echoing the chaos below. Corin's cry rose higher. Jaren's hands were open, pleading. "Please, he's a baby. You can't hold a child like that. Hand him to me." Slowly. But Redden's grin only widened. "He's not made of glass." That was the moment Jaren saw it. Redden's eyes darted once, just briefly, upward, not at the baby, not at the passengers, at the ceiling panel above them. And in that flash, everything made sense. Earlier, Redden had tapped it, traced the panel's edge with his fingers, as if testing. This wasn't random behavior. This wasn't even spontaneous aggression. It was a setup. Jaren inhaled sharply through his nose. The implication was too large to process, but the danger was real and immediate. His son was suspended midair by someone unbalanced, unrestrained, and clearly enjoying the power of the moment. Jaren's mind raced. If he lunged, Redden might jerk. If he shouted, it could escalate. He could feel the cabin closing in, tight with fear, held hostage by one man's audacity. Then the plane rocked slightly again, turbulence brushing through the fuselage like a warning whisper. Redden's arm wobbled, his grip on Corin less stable than before. "Hand him to me," Jaren said again, but this time his voice was no longer pleading. It was a command. Passengers began rising. Not many, just a few, but enough to murmur, enough to make noise. One man shouted toward the front, "Get the flight attendants." Another woman screamed, "Put the baby down." But Redden stayed where he was, smiling, even as his hand trembled with the effort of holding the squirming infant. "This is just a moment, Malvec," Redden muttered, his tone lower now, almost private. "You don't want to overreact and make it worse." The use of Jaren's last name made him pause. Redden knew who he was. This wasn't coincidence. And still, Corin hung between them, an innocent piece in a twisted game. Jaren's fingers flexed. He glanced at the distance between them, the position of the armrest, the clearance to move. The angles weren't perfect, but they were enough. No one else was going to stop this. Not the passengers. Not the crew. Only him. "Last chance," Jaren said. Redden blinked. Then Jaren's voice dropped, firm, low, controlled. "Hand. Him. To me." But the taunting grin returned, and Redden tilted Corin slightly as if pretending to toss a ball. Jaren moved. It wasn't rage. It wasn't panic. It was a culmination of every protective instinct sharpened by strategic calculation. His torso twisted, one foot braced against the edge of the seat. With pinpoint force, he drove a rising kick directly into Redden's midsection, angled not to cause fatal harm, but enough to launch the man upward, unbalanced, and out of control. The result was explosive. Redden's body jerked back. His grip on Corin released instantly. As he rose with the kick's momentum, the top of his head collided with the ceiling panel in a sickening thunk, cracking the surface and silencing the cabin. Jaren caught Corin in the same breath, pulling him against his chest as the baby sobbed in confusion. Redden collapsed backward into the row behind them, moaning as he slumped across two seats, the dent in the ceiling above him glaring like a wound. The only sound now was Corin's cries and the rustle of stunned passengers shifting in their seats. Jaren didn't move again. He held his son close, whispering soft reassurances, eyes never leaving the man sprawled across the seats, bruised and breathless. Above them, the ceiling crack whispered a different kind of warning. The moment becomes a breaking point, and resolution can come only through swift, strategic action. A father's limit is reached the moment fear becomes undeniable. Redden's grip shifted slightly on the baby's arm. That was the only signal Jaren needed. His mind snapped into full clarity. Not the fog of panic, but the crisp mathematical space where instinct met strategy. In that suspended second, he saw everything. The tilt of Redden's wrist, the angle of Corin's tiny body dangling too far from center, the lack of support, the laughter, that sick, hollow sound coming from a grown man who treated an infant like a toy. "Let go of my son," Jaren said, voice even but thunderously calm. His fingers twitched near the buckle, calculating. Redden didn't respond with words. He gave a smirk and jostled the child deliberately, just once, as though making a point. The gesture was small, but it turned the blood in Jaren's veins ice cold. Corin cried out in protest, a shrill sound that sliced through the rising chaos around them. Passengers gasped. A man in the next row tried to rise, but the renewed turbulence knocked him back into his seat. The service cart rattled, stuck mid-aisle like a metal blockade. Crew members shouted from behind it, but they couldn't reach them yet. There was no one coming. Jaren had seconds, less. His hand moved with silent purpose, unbuckling his seatbelt in one swift motion. He rose in a fluid arc, not lunging, not screaming, but positioning. Precision over panic. He calculated his strike mid-motion, drawing from years of physical training, boardroom pressure, and defense systems design. Everything he knew about reaction, timing, balance, and force condensed into one singular decision. Don't do something you'll regret, Redden sneered, shifting his feet, the baby still held precariously in one hand. But Jaren wasn't listening anymore. His mind wasn't on Redden's words. It was on the trajectory. He pivoted sharply, planted one foot against the seat support beside him, and thrust his other leg upward with a focused, devastating kick, his heel driving straight into Redden's torso, just below the rib cage. The sound was brutal, a deep, fleshy thump, followed by a hard crack as Redden's back collided with the ceiling panel. For a moment, his body seemed to hang midair, suspended by the sheer force of the impact. Then gravity reclaimed him. He dropped awkwardly, slamming across two seats and gasping for breath. One of the ceiling panels remained cracked open, a jagged corner poking out as visual proof of the contact. Corin slipped from his loosening grip mid-fall. Jaren moved with surgical speed, cradling the baby against his chest before he could even register fall. Corin sobbed, red-faced and trembling but safe, secure, breathing. Jaren dropped into his seat, clutching the child to his body like a fortress closing around its treasure. His breathing was heavy, but his expression remained unreadable. Not triumphant, not remorseful, just resolved. Around them, the cabin had turned into a stunned tableau. Mouths hung open, fingers pointed. No one spoke, except Redden, who let out a wheezing moan from where he lay crumpled over the armrest, limbs askew. He didn't move. Not yet. Is the baby okay? A man across the aisle finally whispered. Jaren didn't answer right away. He looked down at Corin, now buried against his chest, his small hands clinging to his shirt as the sobs began to slow. He stroked the back of his son's head gently, pressing his lips against the fine baby hair with quiet steadiness. He's all right, Jaren murmured at last, barely loud enough to be heard. Behind him, the crew finally forced the cart aside, stumbling forward as they tried to understand what had just happened. A flight attendant called out Redden's name, confusion and panic in his voice. Another glanced up at the broken ceiling panel and paled. Passengers again shouting over one another, "He attacked the baby!" That man saved him. It was like a reflex. He didn't even hesitate. Larrick Dane, who had seen it all from a row back, rose shakily to his feet. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Jaren with wide eyes full of regret and awe. Eventually, he found words. "I saw the way he looked at your son," he muttered. "I should have said something sooner." Jaren didn't look up. He didn't blame him. He didn't need to. This wasn't about blame anymore. One of the attendants finally stepped forward and opened his mouth to ask something, but Jaren spoke first. He was holding my son by one arm. Jaren said evenly, still shielding the baby. In midair, while the plane shook. It was all he needed to say. The message landed harder than the kick had. The attendant swallowed hard, nodding without argument. No further explanation required. As Redden groaned and twitched on the seats, drawing weak breath into his lungs, the rest of the plane remained caught between awe and confusion. No one quite knew how to respond. Some began clapping. Others just watched, stunned, as a father sat protecting his child in the middle of chaos. The flight was still in the air. The weather outside still shook the wings. But the cabin had crossed a threshold, one that would change the trajectory of this journey forever. Jaren held Corin with both arms, as if willing his own pulse to slow down. But the war inside him wasn't adrenaline, it was aftermath. What would follow this? Who would believe what had just happened? What had been planned? He didn't know. Not yet. But for now, the child was safe. That was enough. He shifted in his seat, repositioning the blanket to cover Corin's face from any wandering cameras. As he sat back and stared ahead into the still rattling cabin, the pain in his knee caught up to him, a reminder of the price, but not a regret, not even close. The strike wasn't rage. It was a rescue shaped by necessity. For a long second, no one moved. No one breathed. Redden Corval's body sagged awkwardly across two seats, his limbs twitching in disoriented spasms. Above him, the ceiling panel bore the unmistakable dent of impact. Fiberglass cracked at its center, a sharp edge slightly peeled where his back and skull had collided. A few ceiling lights flickered, not from turbulence now, but from the very force of the strike. The hush that followed was heavier than silence. It was disbelief trying to find its voice. Jaren Malvec didn't care about any of it. Not the gasps, not the stares, not the buzz beginning to hum between rows. His world narrowed to the tiny form squirming in his arms, whimpering softly with the aftershock of fear. Corin's cry wasn't loud. It was the kind of cry a baby makes when they don't understand what just happened, but know it wasn't safe. Jaren leaned down, pressing his lips to the infant's forehead, whispering words that Evie couldn't fully hear over the roaring pulse in his ears. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice uneven. "You're safe. I've got you." Rows behind him began to stir, some passengers rising slowly, others peeking over seatbacks. Whispers passed like sparks down a line. Did he really kick him? He saved the baby. What just happened? But no one spoke loudly yet, the shock still too fresh. Then came movement. Larrick Dane stood, pale, his hands trembling at his sides. The weight of guilt painted his face with grim regret. His voice cracked as he stepped into the aisle, eyes fixed on Jaren. "I saw it coming," he said, almost himself. "I should have warned you." His shoulders slumped slightly, as if those words carried more than apology, like they carried failure. Jaren didn't respond, not because he was angry, but because his focus remained locked on the small chest rising and falling against his. His body remained curled protectively around Corin, knees braced, mind scanning for what came next. The moment was not over. It had only shifted shape. Down the aisle, the drink cart rattled as it was finally pushed free. Two flight attendants emerged behind it, breathless and wide-eyed. The first was a young man with jet black hair and a name tag reading Vask. His shoes scraped to a halt when he saw the scene. Redden sprawled across the row, groaning. Ceiling dented. He stared for a moment too long. "What?" he began. Jaren lifted his head sharply. His voice cut through the murmurs, controlled and direct. "He dangled my child in the air by one arm." The statement fell like a gavel. Passengers who had been uncertain now found their footing. A few gasped anew. Some exchanged horrified glances. One man near the window closed his eyes and muttered a curse under his breath. A woman seated across the aisle placed a hand over her chest. Her gaze locked on the bruised man slumped nearby. And then, clapping. Sparse at first, one or two slow bursts of palm against palm, until it grew louder. It wasn't a celebration. It was recognition. Recognition that someone had acted before it was too late. Vast's expression changed, from confusion to comprehension, and then to something like dread. He took a step closer to the injured man, eyes narrowing. There was a beat of silence before he turned to the second attendant behind him and said quietly, "That's Corval." He was flagged. He wasn't supposed to fly. "What?" the other man whispered back. His voice shook. He was grounded last month for erratic behavior. Internal memo said blacklist. I saw it myself. Vask's face tightened. How did he get on this manifest? That question struck deeper than anyone realized. Jaren didn't flinch. His mind was already racing, pieces falling into place. He knew what was coming. Interviews, incident reports, maybe even legal investigations. A man had been assaulted mid-flight, even if justifiably. And justifiable didn't always mean exonerated. There would be stories, misinterpretations, spin, but none of that could matter, not until Corin was safe. He looked down at his son again. The baby's eyes fluttered, still watery but calm now. Jaren exhaled, slow and steady, letting that image root him. Behind him, more passengers murmured about what they'd witnessed. One man recounted the moment Redden lunged. Another described how he saw Jaren brace before the strike. Lyric still stood nearby, a silent witness with regret carved into his expression. Just then, Jaren's phone buzzed faintly in his coat pocket, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. He heard Vask speaking again, louder now. "We need to notify the captain. Emergency protocol. And secure that passenger before he wakes fully." Jaren shifted his grip on Corin slightly and glanced at the attendant. "You want a full record of this," he said. "Witnesses, statements, and I'll be providing one too. But my son comes first." Vask gave a quick, respectful nod. "Understood, sir. We'll take care of the rest." Jaren's mind returned to strategy. The ceiling panel. The broken chain of security. The recognition in the attendant's voice. Something had failed long before Redden reached for his child. The aftermath wasn't just about a man on a plane. It was about how he got there, why he was allowed to sit next to the child, and what mechanisms had ignored the risk. Jaren leaned his head back briefly, closing his eyes. Not to rest, but to lock this moment into memory. Because memory, like evidence, could not be rewritten. Not by rumors. Not by headlines. And when he opened his eyes again, Corin nestled against him like a weight of truth. A protective act doesn't wait for approval. It answers to urgency. Redden's body thudded against the cabin wall as the turbulence eased, just enough for the crew to act. Two male flight attendants, one of them the wiry and sharp-eyed Darnell Vask, stepped forward, their movements rehearsed and precise. Together, they lifted the dazed man from where he slumped, carefully avoiding contact with the cracked ceiling panel. They didn't speak much, just exchanged glances heavy with tension and unspoken alarm, as they escorted Redden toward the back of the aircraft. A row near the tail had been cleared, and there, with hushed urgency, they secured him using soft restraints designed for disruptive passengers. His arms were belted to the seat rests, ankles gently looped and latched beneath. He mumbled at first, groggy and disoriented, but soon began to regain coherence. As they fastened the last strap, Redden blinked rapidly and slurred. "It was just a joke. I wasn't going to hurt anyone." Darnell didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, lips pressed into a firm line, eyes flicking to the overhead panel with its visible dent. He turned and whispered to his colleague, a younger crewman named Vale. "We flagged him last month. His name shouldn't even be on this manifest." Jaren Malvek sat mid-cabin, still holding Corin close beneath a folded blanket. The baby stirred faintly but didn't cry. Jaren's eyes remained fixed on the aisle, his body angled to shield his son from view. His breathing had steadied, but his mind raced. He had learned long ago, in his days designing defense protocols, that victory was not just about immediate survival. It was about aftermath, narrative, control of facts. Now, those instincts sharpened again, reawakening beneath the weariness of fatherhood. He watched the movements of the crew, the way they avoided making eye contact with him, the way some passengers looked away too quickly. Behind him, the murmurs began. A man 2 rows up shook his head and said, "That guy was laughing. He grabbed the baby. No way that was a joke." Another replied, "Yeah, he dangled the kid like it was a game or something." Redden, barely audible, repeated again from the back of the cabin. It was a joke. Just a joke. People overreacted. Jaren's jaw tensed. He looked to his left, where his 15-year-old brother Jalen sat quietly, his body stiff. Jaren leaned in and spoke low, measured. "Was your phone on?" he asked, eyes still facing forward. Jalen nodded, almost ashamed, like he'd broken a rule. "I was filming the view, but I got it." From the moment he reached for Corin, Jaren didn't show relief, but a muscle in his neck eased slightly. "Good," he said. Then he turned his head fully and locked eyes with his brother. "Don't post it. Not yet. This isn't about revenge. It's about proof." Jalen swallowed hard and nodded again, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered near his phone screen. Outside the window, clouds drifted by in calm contrast to the unrest inside. In the aisle, Darnell walked briskly back toward the galley, stopping halfway as he passed Jaren's row. Their eyes met. Darnell hesitated. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, maybe shame. Then he moved on. Jaren leaned back into his seat, pulling the blanket higher over Corin. His thoughts moved quickly now. He recalled headlines, competitors, and whispers from boardrooms about how errant systems had disrupted too much, too fast. He thought about Havex, the bitter rival who had once tried to undercut their AI safety systems with cheaper, rush code. Could this all have been spontaneous? Could it truly be random? No, his gut said otherwise. He replayed the man's words from earlier, the smile, the fidgeting, the way Redden had tapped the ceiling panel. The line about how tough babies should be. All of it felt like provocation, not impulse. More murmurs swept the cabin as passengers shared versions of what they saw. Some supported Jaren. Others questioned the force he'd used. The turbulence hadn't helped, had obscured much of what had happened. But Jaren understood the deeper risk now. Perception. The truth was on his side, but that didn't guarantee protection. What guaranteed it was evidence. People can lie about what they meant, he whispered to himself, but not about what they did. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket, likely a text from his legal counsel, already alerted by Jaren's initial secure message before the flight. He didn't check it yet. Instead, he glanced at Corin, whose tiny hand peeked out from beneath the blanket. He brushed his son's fingers with his own. The warmth of that small hand returned focus to his mission, not as a CEO, but as a father. He wasn't looking for retribution. He didn't care for headlines or viral labels. All that mattered now was ensuring no other child ever became collateral in someone else's agenda. He turned to Jalen once more. "Keep the file safe," he said. "Time it right. The truth matters more when it's backed by evidence, not anger." The wheels began to lower with a metallic thump beneath the cabin floor as the aircraft started its final descent toward Norvane International. Seatbelt signs blinked. Overhead lights dimmed. The hush that fell across the cabin was not the kind of quiet that came from calm. It was a weight of unresolved tension pressing down on every row like altitude. Jaren Malvex sat stiffly, holding his son Corin close, the child now resting with his cheek against his father's shoulder. His grip hadn't loosened since the incident. Every now and then, Corin stirred with a small twitch or whimper, and Jaren would whisper something gentle, though his voice carried an edge, like someone trying to soothe a storm inside with only fragments of words. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with mechanical efficiency, but there was a hushed urgency behind every clipped instruction. Darnell Vask, the senior attendant who had arrived too late to stop Redden, avoided Jaren's gaze as he checked overhead compartments. 2 rows back, another attendant, having door, leaned toward a passenger and whispered, "They're calling in ground security. Captain wants him at the gate before the brakes even cool." His voice was low, but Jaren caught it. So did others. A group of passengers, including the elderly man who had witnessed everything from across the aisle, exchanged murmurs. Some nodded toward Jaren, whispering words like brave, did what he had to, and hero. But the praise fell hollow to Jaren. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had been forced to choose between calculation and instinct, and had chosen both under crushing pressure. He turned to Jalen, seated quietly beside him with his phone screen dimmed but still open on the video. The teen's face was tight with unspoken thought, jaw clenched. He looked up and whispered, "You need to see this." He didn't wait for permission. He just handed the phone over. Jaren tapped to replay the sequence. His breath caught, not at the part where Redden sees Corin, not even at the moment he launched a kick that sent the man crashing into the ceiling panel. It was a moment before that, subtle, almost invisible if you weren't watching for it. Across the aisle, a man in a navy suit with slick back hair and a business tablet resting on his lap had shifted his hand slightly. Just before Redden lunged, the man gave a faint, deliberate nod, nothing more than a chin dip, but it was timed with precision, the kind of timing that wasn't random. "Replay that," Jaren said, his voice a whisper carved from stone. Jalen did. Again. Then slowed the footage. The nod was unmistakable now. "Who is he?" Jalen asked. Jaren didn't answer immediately. His mind sifted through memories, recent briefings, the last few competitive audits. His role at Aaron Systems meant he often faced competitors displeased by his proposals for AI-driven civilian safety platforms. His company's win on the Sky Shield bid last quarter had cost someone millions, and not everyone played fair. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense, too much sense. Redden wasn't unstable by chance. He had been placed, or at least allowed aboard with deliberate purpose. The timing, the seating, the orchestrated escalation. It all reeked of something designed, not spontaneous. And the nod? It wasn't an accident. It was a cue. "Do not share this video," Jaren said firmly. "Not yet." Jalen blinked. "Even with the crew?" "Especially not the crew." Jaren's tone was calm but layered with weight. "We'll send it securely to legal." Jalen nodded. "Understood." The descent grew steeper. The seatbelt sign dinged again. Jaren tightened the strap across his lap and drew Corin closer, his free hand shielding the baby's fragile head as the pressure shift tickled the child's ears. Around them, murmurs continued, some supportive, others speculative. "Think he's going to be arrested?" "I heard someone say the guy had been flagged before. What's he even doing on a plane?" "He should sue the airline." IDV done worse than kick him. Jaren tried to shut it out. Noise was noise. But beneath the layers of conversation, one thought kept rising. They sent someone after my son. The fury that thought stirred was cold, not explosive. Measured, controlled, strategic. If someone tried to corner him into reacting, they had failed. What they had triggered instead was resolve. He opened his encrypted messaging app and typed a brief message to his legal counsel. Video shows third-party signaling attacker, not disclosing to crew. Forwarding clip. Prepare motion. Attachment sent. Below them, city lights blinked through thinning clouds. The runway approached. Fast. Jaren leaned his head back slightly, eyes locked forward. His chest rose and fell in slow, disciplined breaths. He didn't know who the man in the suit was yet, but he would, and when he did, the entire strategy would be dissected, exposed, and turned into precedent. The wheels slammed down with a sharp jolt. The cabin rocked. Some passengers gasped. Others braced against their armrests. The engines howled in reverse thrust. The aircraft slowed. Flashing blue and red lights lit up the windows. Security vehicles were already waiting just off the taxiway. Jaren whispered to his son, without breaking his gaze from the front of the cabin. "It's okay. We're almost through." He adjusted Corin's blanket gently as the jet rolled to its gate. Through the crack between seats, he saw a figure in yellow security vest walking toward the bridge controls. The connection to the jetway hissed into place with a deep thump. A voice on the intercom announced that everyone should remain seated until instructed to disembark row by row. Jaren didn't move. Across the aisle, the man in the Navy suit was gone. His seat was empty. The tension around Jaren solidified like glass ready to crack. He braced Corin again, kissed the top of his son's head, and watched the forward cabin door unlock. The plane wheels touched the runway with a hard thud, jostling everyone upright. Jaren braces Corin and looks ahead as flashing lights wait outside. The landing was physical, but the real descent is just beginning. The passenger smirked, convinced his prank would make everyone laugh. Unaware that every second he held that child off balance pushed the father closer to a line he would not let anyone cross. When the father stood, the entire row froze, sensing the storm coming. If you believe cruelty disguised as humor always folds when power meets purpose, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Redden's boots scrape against the jet bridge floor as security officers drag him forward, but he fights for one final moment of attention. Twisting his head over his shoulder, his voice slices through the murmur of the cabin like a blade. "You should have played along, Malvec. You really should have." The words hang in the air like the aftermath of a lightning strike. Rows of stunned passengers gasp. Some instinctively lean back in their seats, as if the threat might jump from Redden's mouth and lash out. Others stare at Jaren, not in judgment, but in sudden, Chilling realization. Jaren doesn't flinch. He simply narrows his eyes. That wasn't just nonsense. It was a message. Deliberate. Targeted. His instincts, sharpened by years of strategic pattern recognition and corporate defense modeling, flare like a silent alarm. This wasn't random at all. This was designed. His son had been bait. And now, as the man who dangled Corin is escorted away, the real threat is only starting to reveal itself. 2 security officers in dark navy uniforms remain behind. One of them, Officer Tarandros, a man in his late 40s with sharp brow and military posture, steps toward Jaren. "Sir, I'll need your statement as soon as possible," he says in a low, respectful tone, glancing at the baby nestled against Jaren's chest. Jaren adjusts Corin's blanket with one hand, keeping his voice level. "I'll be glad to cooperate," he says calmly, but not without legal representation present. Dross doesn't argue. He simply nods once, then steps back. "Understood. We'll escort you to a private lounge once you disembark. For now, please remain seated until the aisle clears." Jaren nods, expression unreadable. As the cabin begins to deplane, murmurs flow around him like water over stones. Did you hear what that guy said? He knew Malvec by name. This was personal. That wasn't just a freak out. That was targeted. Through it all, Jaren stays still, hands resting lightly around Corin, who has fallen back asleep against the warmth of his father's chest. Jalen leans across the aisle, holding his phone with both hands. "I've still got the footage," the teen says in a whisper, his face pale but steady. "All of it. Keep it safe," Jaren replies, low enough only Jalen can hear. "And don't show it to anyone yet. But it's already out there, isn't it?" Jaren's eyes narrow. Not the full picture. What's online is noise. We'll release the truth on our terms. Moments later, the doors of the aircraft open with metallic hiss, and a flash from a camera pierces the shadows of the jet bridge. Already? As Jaren steps out, the brightness outside contrasts harshly with the tense dimness of the plane. A cluster of airline staff waits at the gate, flanked by 2 uniformed security personnel. And beyond them, across the security glass, flashes, journalists, or opportunists. A voice rises from somewhere behind the barrier. "That's him, Malvec. He kicked the guy into the ceiling." Jaren's jaw tightens. Corin stirs. He adjusts his grip and keeps walking, ignoring the eyes and whispers and cameras. But inside, another calculation is running. His mind processes probabilities, outcomes, timing. Not just about safety, but narrative, control, impact. In the private security lounge beyond the gate, a steel door swings open to reveal 3 suited men from Aaron Systems waiting for him. His legal counsel, Marek Thorne, nods respectfully as Jaren enters. No greetings, no pleasantries, just immediate briefing. "Someone's leaking early," Marek says, already holding out a tablet. Footage from a passenger, probably seat 23B. 30-second clip, blurry, shows the kick, but not what led up to it. Jaren schemes the screen. It's enough to stir outrage, but without context, it's incomplete. Conveniently incomplete. They're trying to shape the story before the facts can land. Marek adds. A few outlets already have headlines like, "CEO assaults passenger in mid-air altercation." And Havex? Jaren asks, eyes unmoving from the screen. Marek hesitates. There's chatter. Not confirmed, but your name's trending alongside theirs. Jalen speaks up quietly from behind. Redden said something right before they took him. That dad should have played along. Marek looks sharply at Jaren. That changes everything. It confirms what I suspected, Jaren replies. This wasn't spontaneous. It was bait, manufactured provocation, probably with legal backlash in mind. Jalen nods. But I didn't post anything. Our video's still private. Keep it that way for now, Jaren says. We'll need it, but not for clicks. Marek steps forward, lowering his voice. If Havex is behind this, they're not trying to win in court. They're trying to damage your reputation, make you look volatile, unsafe, like your own AI safety models can't even protect your family. And they failed Jaron says, finally lifting his eyes from the screen. For a moment, silence reigns. Outside the tinted window, another flash goes off. Distant voices call his name. Marek exhales slowly. We're preparing a response. But the board wants to know, what's your next move? Jaron shifts Corin gently, brushing a hand over his son's head. We don't hide the truth, he says, his voice steady, eyes on the glass. We document it, and we control its release. He turns toward the exit, and as he steps back out under flickering lights of the terminal, his image already framed in headlines and whispers, he carries not just his child, but the weight of something larger. A test, a trap, and now, a spotlight he never asked for, but fully intends to use. They wanted to make a spectacle, but they forgot who they gave the spotlight to. The footage hit the internet before sunrise. It wasn't Jalen's polished video. It wasn't part of Jaron's plan. It was a shaky vertical clip, captured from 3 rows back, filmed by a passenger named Torek Velden. The 37-second recording opened mid-chaos, Redden Corval laughing loudly as he dangled baby Corin by one arm, the infant's feet swaying helplessly. Jaron's voice was barely audible through the background gasps, measured, calm, almost begging. And then came the pivot, the kick, and the dull thud of body meeting ceiling panel. The video ended with screams and the visible jostling of the camera as passengers scrambled to understand what had just happened. Within an hour, it had gone viral. By 7 a.m., major social channels flooded with reposts. Hashtag surged. Hashtag ceiling kick dad. Hashtag save the baby. Hashtag Flight 822 incident. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Some praised Jaron as protector, a hero who acted when no one else did. Others, lacking context, called him a violent passenger endangering others on a plane. Influencers, podcasters, and pundits weighed in, many without even watching the clip all the way through. The spectacle had begun. In the quiet of his Norvane hotel room, Jaron stood motionless, Corin asleep against his chest. The news played in the background on low volume, broadcasting a loop of the viral clip. Each replay sent a silent storm through him. Not regret, he had none, but the familiar chill of manipulation. He had seen this before, in meetings where perception outweighed truth. Now he was at the center of it. Jalen sat nearby, phone in hand, eyes wide. They already twisted it, the teenager murmured, scrolling through comments. Some are saying you overreacted. Others are calling it staged. Jaron inhaled slowly. That's why we waited. That's why we planned. He turned away from the screen and opened a secured folder. Inside was Jalen's clean, high-definition footage. Every moment from the moment Redden first leaned over to the exact second he was launched into the ceiling. Context, audio, visual, timestamps, multiple angles. We don't rush to defend, Jaron said. We present. Let them fight shadows, we hold the light. He sent the footage directly to his legal advisor, Air Systems Chief Counsel Arvin Jorek, with concise note. Prepare the submission to Valoris Airlines and the National Aviation Ethics Board. We move forward officially, not online. As the digital world spiraled, Jaron chose silence. He declined interview requests, dozens of them. He ignored messages from media outlets fishing for exclusive angles. He let the public burn itself out on speculation. Meanwhile, his legal team drafted a formal complaint outlining not only the assault, but also Valoris Airlines' negligence in seating a known unstable man beside an infant. The footage was submitted privately, unpublished, unedited, to authorities and the ethics board. And then the real twist came. Late that afternoon, Arvin Jorek called. His voice was quiet, the kind that only meant one thing. Discovery. We ran a background trace on Redden, Arvin said. Not just standard ID. Cross-reference with contractor registries and competitive vendor logs. Jaron sat forward. Go on. He's not just a problematic flyer. He's a freelance contractor, recently contracted by Havex Dynamics. 2 months ago. Jaron felt the words land like gravel in his gut. Havex Dynamics, the same corporation that lost a federal bid to Air Systems for the Urban Guardian Safety Infrastructure Project. A project centered on real-time passenger behavior analysis and AI safety enforcement. The same one, Ja. Wren had presented to Congress after years of development. The same one Havex had tried and failed to discredit during bidding. Arvin continued. There's more. The man in the business suit across the aisle, the one who nodded just before Redding grabbed Corin, we isolated him from the footage. His facial ID matches a Havex operations consultant, Varric Thorne. Jaren's breath caught. So this wasn't just a meltdown, he said aloud. It was calculated. Arvin confirmed it with silence. Jaren stood, carrying Corin gently into the crib. He walked back to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The city of Norvain spread out below in calm disinterest, unaware of the chaos that had begun midair. He could feel the old instincts return, not fear, but readiness. The same composure he once used while designing predictive threat models was now activated for something more personal. They wanted me to react, he said to no one. They wanted a headline. CEO loses control on plane. A spectacle. And instead, Jalen said from across the room, they got a father saving his kid. Jaren looked over his shoulder. His voice was steady. They got bait, and now we give them consequence. He opened a new secure channel and began drafting a message, not for press, but for the National Aviation Ethics Board. Every detail, every finding, every pixel of truth. Outside, the world still argued. Headlines shifted. Opinions swirled. But Jaren Malvec had already chosen his path. They wanted a backlash. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He turned off the television, walked back to Corin's crib, and adjusted the blanket gently over his son's legs. So this wasn't just an assault. It was bait, and they wanted a backlash. The committee room fell into silence the moment the footage ended. The screen dimmed, and the final frame, Redden's smirking face as he dangled the infant Corin, froze midair like a photograph the room would never forget. The only sound was a lower of the ceiling fan and the distant hum of traffic beyond the heavily secured FAA building in Norvain. Every eye turned to Dr. Jaren Malvec. Seated calmly at the long table, his posture firm, hands folded. Not a flicker of emotion escaped his face, though his mind churned with the weight of what had just been revealed. They had brought him here under the guise of a standard inquiry. Yet the undercurrent in the room, the presence of federal ethics attorneys, airline executives, and high-ranking FAA observers, told Jaren this was no ordinary debrief. This was a tribunal wrapped in procedural language, and Jaren, despite being the victim, knew he had to navigate it as though under crosshairs. A balding man in a pinstripe suit cleared his throat. Dr. Malvec, thank you for your patience. We've reviewed the footage submitted by your brother, Jalen Malvec. Could you explain, in your own words, what prompted your response during the incident? Jaren's voice was measured and composed, carrying the calm certainty of someone who had calculated every outcome before speaking. I assessed that my son's life was at immediate risk. The individual, Redden Corval, lifted my 6-month-old child by one arm during turbulence. His grip was unstable. His behavior was erratic. Intervention was not a choice. It was the only ethical course of action. He paused. One of the FAA observers, a tall man with a trimmed beard and tablet in hand, leaned forward. Your response was forceful. Jaren met his gaze. My response was calibrated. A grab could have triggered a drop. Words had failed. I struck in a manner that neutralized the threat without escalating further harm. My child was in the air. My instincts were guided by experience and necessity. Another panelist, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses and an airline badge, interjected. Mr. Corval had been cleared to fly. He passed background and security checks. With respect, Jaren interrupted, his tone still even. He had been removed from 2 prior flights for aggressive conduct. Yet he was re-cleared due to influence from external sources, one of which we now know is tied to Havoc's dynamics. A low murmur broke across the room. The mention of Havex, a known rival to Errant Systems, shifted the temperature. Jaren continued. The man across the aisle, Varric Thorne, was not a stranger either. Your internal security logs identified him as a contractor linked to Havex's private wing. He signaled before Corval acted. That was no coincidence. Silence again. The tribunal chair, a straight-backed FAA director named Moronfelt, narrowed his eyes. Mr. Thorne has since left the country. Facial recognition caught him under a secondary identity, leaving Norvane Terminal less than 4 hours after landing. Jaren nodded slightly, unsurprised, because this wasn't spontaneous misconduct. It was a staged provocation, a bait operation. I was meant to react poorly so they could discredit me, my ethics platform, and my company's public standing. Dramatic irony hung thick in the air. Here he was, the man whose child had nearly been harmed, not pleading for leniency, but proving systemic breach and manipulation with surgical clarity. Another voice chimed in, softer this time. It was a federal ethics advisor seated at the end. Dr. Malvek. Do you believe retaliation was a goal? No, Jaren replied. His gaze was sharp but calm. They didn't expect retaliation. They expected me to break, to fail. But I didn't retaliate. He paused, letting the silence build like pressure in the cabin of a climbing jet. I intervened. That single sentence landed harder than any evidence. Several members on the panel shifted in their seats, no longer analyzing a man under scrutiny, but absorbing the words of someone who had held the line when no system did. Behind him, one of the screen technicians quietly rewound the footage for archival purposes, but nobody looked at the monitor anymore. They were watching Jaren now. The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was consensus, forming slowly and silently, as when a storm ends and the air becomes still. One by one, the panelists made small gestures of acknowledgement. A nod, a note scribbled with newfound intent, a breath let out in relief or guilt. Even the skeptical observer with the tablet lowered his gaze. The chair spoke last. We'll deliberate further and prepare recommendations for both airline and federal review. But Dr. Malvek, thank you. Today, you reminded us of something we forget too easily. Jaren stood. He gave a courteous nod, but said nothing further. He didn't need to. As he walked out of the tribunal room, past polished floors and waiting press lines, past locked doors and mirror glass, the line he left behind settled deeper into the walls of that room than any law book ever could. The system doesn't always protect. Sometimes it needs reminding how to. The footage hit the public like lightning. He didn't begin with statistics, charts, or mission statements. He stood still at the center of the wide stage, a soft white spotlight cutting through the dimness to rest on his form. No podium, no barrier between himself and the truth. He held the microphone in one hand like he held his son that night, firm, protective, unmoving. For a moment, he said nothing. Silence did what preambles couldn't. When a man grabbed my son by one arm on Flight 822, Jaren said, his voice steady, I didn't think about press or cameras or lawsuits. I thought about what happens when systems fail the most vulnerable, when protocol defers a delay, and no one acts until it's too late. The air in the hall thickened. Executives leaned forward. Analysts froze mid-keystroke. Somewhere in the front row, Jalen Malvek sat still, eyes locked on his older brother. No cameras in hand this time. Just attention, raw and undivided. Jaren paced slowly across the stage. I built systems to detect pattern disruption, behavioral flags, predictive alerts. That night, those systems lived in my mind, not a server, and I saw the breach coming. But it wasn't just one unstable man. It was a breakdown of everything we say we safeguard. The silence of crew members, the faulty clearance system, the failure of foresight. He let the words sit. He watched them land. The question isn't why I kicked him, Jaren continued. The question is, why was I the only barrier between harm and a 6-month-old child? Behind the curtain stage left, his legal advisor stood next to 2 airline safety regulators. Their posture shifted. What was once a polite professional stance became the quiet stillness of personal reckoning. I don't need applause, Jaren said, lowering his tone. I need promises. That when you clear a passenger, it means something. That your safety manuals don't gather dust. That your seats for families aren't determined by convenience, but by conscience. A man in the second row, an executive from Branair, pressed a hand to his temple. Another beside him, from Crestline Transit, slowly uncrossed his arms. Do you know what's heavier than kicking someone into a ceiling? Jaron asked, his voice growing softer. Cradling your child afterward, praying that you timed it right, that the scream didn't mean damage, that the story you'll tell him one day won't be that his father had to choose between obedience and instinct. A moment passed, then another. Not a word stirred. Jaron finally took a breath and scanned the room. This platform, this stage, it isn't power. It's a reminder that inaction isn't always passive. Sometimes it's complicity. A slow, thoughtful applause started at the back of the hall, then the front, then it swept across the room like a current. But Jaron didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge it with nods or bows. He stepped back, placed a mic on the stool, and exited stage right without waiting for an ovation to finish. Backstage, Jalen was already waiting, standing beside a small monitor showing the delayed conference feed. His phone was untouched in his pocket. You think people will forget? Jalen asked, voice low, his eyes still watching the last frame of the stage broadcast before it faded. Jaron exhaled, resting one hand on his younger brother's shoulder. His face was calm, the same practiced composure that once launched negotiations, now repurposed for protection. They'll forget the panel, he said without hesitation, turning his eyes away from the screen and toward the hallway where a nursery light flickered from an open door. Not the ceiling. The verdict dropped like a silent gavel across the digital airwaves. Redden Corval, convicted on multiple counts, including endangerment of a minor, reckless assault aboard a commercial aircraft, and conspiracy linked to corporate coercion. A permanent federal ban barred him from air travel, effective immediately. But the real weight of justice wasn't a courtroom. It echoed in terminals, in cabins, in the quiet steps of reform that followed. At Norvane International, the first sign of change stood gleaming beneath the morning light. A silver plaque had been affixed to the white-tiled wall beside Gate 12. The lettering was simple but struck like a quiet drumbeat. To every parent who ever protected their child before anyone else stood up, you are not alone. Jaron Malvek stood in front of it, silent. Beside him, Jalen held the camera steady, not for the media, not for Aaron Systems' PR archive, but for something more sacred, their own history. Corin, now healthier, more curious than ever, sat in his stroller, chewing idly on a soft cloth toy as if untouched by the incident that had changed aviation law. Yet Jaron knew everything from that moment had altered not just policy, but perception. The image of a baby dangled midair, the blur of his foot striking upward into the ceiling, the sound of truth echoing in a cabin of disbelief. It all lingered, like smoke after lightning. The plaque was only the beginning. Across the nation, airports began installing the Sky Shield Infant Safe System, an AI-driven proximity alert platform built by Aaron Systems, activated quietly but efficiently. Any unregistered adult attempting to make physical contact with an infant mid-flight would now trigger silent alerts to crew devices, a protective net woven from code and caution. It wasn't about punishment. It was about prevention. Behind the system's update was Jaron's vision, but not one born from boardroom theory. It was forged under pressure, shaped in a cabin where instincts had outpaced policy. Now, his company didn't just stand for innovation. It stood for vigilance. Think it'll stick? Jalen asked quietly, lowering the lens for a moment as they watched a few travelers stop to read the plaque. Jaron exhaled, hands folded in front of him, his eyes soft but haunted. It better, he said, because if this fades, someone else's child won't have a chance. He didn't mean to sound bitter. He meant to sound exact. Dramatic irony twisted quietly in the background. Many of the same corporate entities that criticized his response now sought licensing rights to Aranta's Sky Shield platform. Among them, even former partners of Havoc's Dynamics, now bleeding government contracts and tied up in federal investigations. Their silence had come too late. Their denials had collapsed beneath whistleblower leaks and Jalen's irrefutable footage. There was one email that stayed with Jaron, a line buried deep in a Havoc server leak. Test a Malvek temperament in a public-facing scenario. The phrase still made his spine stiffen. They hadn't just wanted him to fail. They wanted a scene, a snap, a scandal. Instead, they got precision. They got a ceiling dent. Jaron touched the plaque now, palm flat, as if confirming that it was real. The metal was cold, solid, and oddly comforting. Corin, now humming softly, kicked his feet. His giggle broke the silence. "Got it," Jalen whispered, smiling faintly through the viewfinder. The recording would remain private, stored on an encrypted drive, not for virality. For legacy. Jaren gave one last look at the plaque and turned. He didn't need a speech. He didn't need applause. His son was alive. His brother was safe. The world, slightly better than it had been. As the three walked away into the soft terminal light, travelers passed by unaware of who they were. There were no reporters, no press agents, only a family, one step ahead of the noise. Corin kicked again, laughing this time, a soft, bubbling joy. And for once, the only thing airborne was joy. He never touched the ceiling again, but he raised the standard forever. In a single motion, the father's kick sent the attacker upward, hitting the ceiling panel so hard the cabin fell silent. The joke died instantly, and the crew realized they had underestimated a man who would protect his child at any cost. If you believe real authority defends the innocent with precision, control, and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, cruelty, and the power of standing up for loved ones in moments of injustice. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and spark reflection on accountability, respect, and protecting the vulnerable.